Hello, everyone. In this video, I'm going to continue our previous discussion about competition. So this interspecific interaction in which both parties lose at least a little bit. We were talking about the competitive exclusion principle, which essentially says that two species who occupy the same niche cannot coexist. And so there's this famous example here of two protospecies grown separately just fine, but then when you put them together, there is a clear winner and a clear loser. But then I asked you guys to recall some examples that we were discussing. So red and gray squirrels, seemingly they occupy the same niche. So what's up with that? And then if you look to Africa, for example, there are tons of different species that are occupying what would seem at first glance to be the same niche. So somehow these organisms have avoided competitive exclusion. And as we were discussing, essentially this is completed by niche partitioning. Different species can partition niches apart spatially. So generally this is considered to be in horizontal space. Here we can see each species has its own subset of the parameters of its fundamental niche, or of its fundamental niche, so a much reduced realized niche. This can also be in vertical space as well. So with our classic lizard examples here. Also, we have true vertical niche partitioning. So different animals are able to utilize vegetation at different heights. Also, plants can utilize different space, both above ground as well as below the ground. So both the roots and the shoots. We left off talking about temporal niche partitioning. So different herds are able to migrate back into an area. And so they are taking advantage of the resources within a physical space at different times. So they're not actually directly competing with one another. I also told you guys about ants, right? This example is ants. So here we have clearly nocturnal ants. This species is clearly diurnal. And then when there is less pressure from both the nocturnal ants, which are going to bed, and the diurnal ants, which are waking up, you get these crepuscular ants right here taking advantage of the lessened competition. There's one more example that I want to elaborate on, and that's going to bring us all the way back to the very beginning of our class together. We talked about these termite mounds, right, and how these termite mounds, essentially are uniformly distributed because those termites fiercely compete with each other for resources, right? So that means that those mounds have to be really spread far apart. I want to go back to these environments and point out that the termite mound itself is filled with lots of rich vegetation, so really high quality food. And of course, it is surrounded by grassland, so really different type of environment. Now, there is an ongoing research study of these termite mounds and the herbivores that take advantage of them, in addition to the termites themselves. And so what I want to bring up, the example study that I want to talk about, is looking at 3 different species seemingly occupying the same exact niche, but maybe not. And so the 3 examples here are bushbuck, which is the smallest, nyala, which is the medium-sized herbivore, and then kudu, which is monstrous. Okay, so these 3 different animals seemingly able to eat all of the same foods, right? They both, or all 3 of them, have the same diurnal activities. Okay, and they might actually be in the same vicinity at the same time. So they're not migrating in and out at different times. So scientists essentially want to figure out how these 3 organisms are partitioning the larger niche. And so what they did was they tagged them with both a satellite color as well as a radio telemetry color. So what they could do is they could see exactly where these guys were hanging out, get a pretty good idea of where they were, and then go in with their radiotelemetry gear and really find them on the ground. The reason for this is that they're actually looking for scat, right? So for the poo of these animals, it has to be really fresh. And the reason it has to be really fresh is because once the animal runs off, the scientists collect the scat and they take it right to the lab. And what they do is they analyze the DNA of the partially digested plant material that is still within that scat. So they've been able to compare the DNA from the fecal matter to a data bank of genetic sequences. And so they can actually use what is called DNA metabarcoding to figure out exactly what these individuals ate, within a few hour period. And so this is really new technology. It is relatively non-invasive. Previously, to explore what an animal was eating, you actually had to look at its stomach contents, and so that is obviously not ideal. So this is minimally invasive, and they can learn a lot about the ongoing habits of these animals instead of just learning about one particular moment in time. So really cool upcoming technology. This information is a small subset of the information published in a fairly recent paper. So what they found was that, as you might imagine, these different species are essentially eating different types of foods. Right? Even though they can all eat the same things, what they found is that the bush buck, which is the smallest of the three animals, was spending most of its time on the termite mounds, and therefore it was eating mostly those really highly nutritious foods that were produced by the extra nutrients in the soil of the termite mound itself. And so compare this to the largest, the kudu. Generally, they found that these ones were browsing the lowest quality grasses, right? More of them, but lower quality. And so this makes sense in that the bush buck is by far the smallest. Therefore, it has a relatively higher metabolism than the other two animals do. And furthermore, and maybe more acutely important to the animal, is that it's a lot smaller, and so it might be more vulnerable to predation. So the more time it spends munching around on the low quality grasses, trying to build up to some threshold of enough nutrients, that's just more time spent being vulnerable. And so it makes a lot of sense for the bush buck to have a quick, high quality meal and then to go back into hiding. Okay, and the kudu, on the other hand, it can spend a lot more time browsing lower quality materials because it is so much larger. Okay. And so this is the final type of niche partitioning that I want to mention, and this is called dietary niche partitioning. Essentially, even though all of these animals are living in the same place at the same time, they can all eat the same stuff. They are ultimately divvying up the different resources among the different species. And so what this graph is showing us on the two axes is just a scale that is incorporating a lot of different types of factors, spatial factors, as well as prey, or in this case, vegetation species. And so take-home message here is that generally the species are, or the individuals within a species, are clumping together, and that those clumps have very little overlap between the two species. Okay, so they are partitioning their diet to reduce competition, therefore reduce the negative effect on all of the species. Okay. Over time, this niche partitioning can drive evolution, essentially, right? So it can drive character displacement. Essentially, if an animal is eating only one type of food for any length of time, its morphology, right, the population's morphology is going to shift to maximize the efficiency of eating that particular substance. Over time, over generations, maybe the teeth will get bigger, maybe they will be, you know, able to break down like a rougher material if that is what they're eating for a long time. And so some scientists call these morphological traits ghosts of competition past. So essentially, a lot of the different characteristics, a lot of the different phenotypes that we see in the different species are really just a product of many, many generations of competing, and therefore reducing their niche to some realized niche, okay, so that they aren't so heavily competing with other species. And we've seen this so many different times before. You know, Darwin's finches are a classic example. We see this adaptive radiation driven by competition-based character displacement. We see that giraffes have these ridiculously long necks, and that really is because of competition acting as a selective pressure and therefore exaggerating these characters or these phenotypes. We also see nocturnal animals, right? So they, ultimately partition their niche. They choose the night, right, or somehow come to be active in the night, and over time they are able to see better at night, or they're able to have enhanced other senses, right? So maybe echolocation in bats has evolved as character displacement due to competition with other insectivorous animals during the day. And so I want to show you a brief clip of, again, some anoles. And so this experiment is essentially looking at limb length on these guys, and they're not looking at it in terms of competition, but I want you to think about the fact that competition can drive evolution in the same way.
Jonathan and his colleagues wanted to see if they could observe the lizard's traits evolve by conducting another kind of experiment. Their inspiration was the rapidly changing environment of some of the smallest Caribbean islands. Hurricanes occasionally swamped these tiny islands, scrubbing them free of lizards. The team realized they could use the depleted islands as laboratories. They began their experiment by capturing tree-dwelling anoles on a larger island.
Oh, there's one out there.
Yeah.
Good.
Then they visited 7 islands that a hurricane had cleared of lizards. On each, they placed a female and male anole.
There's too much vegetation.
Yeah, it's just a
These islands have no trees, only small bushes.
In the sun or in the shade?
he's actually...
How would the long-legged lizards fare on thin branches? The next year, the scientists returned.
She will be back.
They found that the mating pairs they had introduced not only survived, but reproduced. And the new population had grown and taken to living on thin branches.
And now she's in my noose.
Good.
The scientists collected the lizards.
So the height off the Every time we found a lizard, we measured how high it was off the ground, 40 centimeters, the diameter of the surface,
Okay.
and whether it was perched head up, head down, or horizontal.
They brought them back to their field lab, took X-rays to precisely measure the length of their legs, and scanned their toe pads. Then they returned each lizard to the exact spot where they had found it.
Okay, all right, well.
Now they had baseline data on the new populations. A year later, they came back.
All right, I think he gave us a slip. Okay, excellent.
And discovered that the average lizard leg had shortened in just 2 generations.
Well, we thought maybe this is just a fluke, a statistical accident. In fact, over 4 years, the populations all got shorter and shorter and shorter legs. Evolution can occur very rapidly when natural selection is strong.
Okay, so that's all I wanted to show you from this experiment. Again, this is this is an experimental situation. There's nothing to do with competition here, but if different species of anole were competing in a particular niche, some might move up branches or might move to bushes that have smaller branches. And of course, over time, in fact, only just a few generations, we can see an actual morphological shift in the average population. So not in individuals, it's not individual legs getting longer and therefore becoming more adapted to this new environment. Instead, it is over multiple generations, the longer-legged anoles are going to be more successful. They are going to eat more, they are going to reproduce more, and therefore the next generation is going to have longer legs. Okay, so competition can be this strong selective pressure that the scientist was just talking about. Okay, and so I think at this point we can appreciate that it's never just one species interacting with one other species. In reality, there's a lot of different competitive interactions happening simultaneously. So if we were to kind of zoom out, what we would see is that there are multiple populations, multiple species that are more prevalent in under some environmental conditions as opposed to other environmental conditions. And so here in this graph, we can see the fundamental niches of 4 different species. Here's an environmental gradient. And if we were to take a sample, right, at any one of these points along the environmental gradient, we would see that there's kind of a different abundance of these different species, okay, because they, are competing, and of course because they are adapted to different zones of tolerance. Again, in reality, these multiple interactions between all these different species are essentially limiting the fundamental niche or the realized niche of these organisms. So there's much less overlap here because of the selection pressure of competition. Okay, so once again, if we were to take a sample at this particular point, we would see what is called the relative abundance of these different species. Okay, all driving each other to live in different places in different ways, and of course, to evolve in the process. Okay. In this Lotka-Volterra model that we've seen again and again and again, I want to point out that the competition coefficients, of course, are really important in deciding the outcome of the competition, right? We looked at that with the 2 different squirrels and with the bald eagle and the osprey. And so once again, I want to point out that the competition coefficients ultimately are very important in determining the size of the population next year, or the change in the population between this year and next year. And of course, this is dependent also on the number of the competitive species, right? How many individuals are going to be exerting this per capita influence on species number 2, for example. Also, the other thing is carrying capacities, right? So different carrying capacities very much affect competition. Now, along an environmental gradient, or even when there are alterations in environmental conditions, this can change both the competition coefficient, right? How well an individual is able to compete. And of course, this ties back to the zone of tolerance, right? If the environment starts to become, kind of closer to those tails, or the areas of stress in the zone of tolerance, then they are not going to be able to compete as well, right? So these competition coefficients aren't fixed, right? They change according to environmental conditions. Furthermore, the carrying capacity, as we have seen, can also change according to environmental conditions. Okay, so if it gets super hot all of a sudden, maybe the food source for a particular animal is going to dry up, and therefore it isn't offering the same nutritional capacity as it was before. And so the carrying capacity of that herbivore is going to decline in response indirectly to the shift in environmental condition. So in your textbook, there's a couple different examples of this. So here we can see 3 different species of fish. The scientists ultimately warmed up the water that they were living in, and they monitored competition. So what they saw was that the 2 species of trout were really strong competitors when the water temperature was really cold. Okay, but as the water warmed up, what they saw was that the trout, right, maybe have reached the stress end of the zone of tolerance, and so they are just trying to exist and aren't really able to compete as strongly. And so we can see that they are able to eat less, right, when they are not able to compete as strongly. At the same time, we can see that the chub was able to compete much better when the water was warmer. Okay, so we can see that in these areas of transition, that this species here is going to become more successful, and these species become less successful. Okay, we can also see this shift in competition over time and in field. So this graph here, also from your textbook, is showing 2 different species of grasses in Zimbabwe over a 10-year period. In the first 2 years of this particular study, this grass was doing really well. Okay, so it's really well adapted to drought conditions. But as the rains returned, this species, right, can do a lot better in wet conditions than it can in dry conditions, and so it was therefore able to outcompete the dry adapted species. Okay, so once again, the competition coefficient and the carrying capacities are not fixed numbers. They are very much tied to abiotic factors. These abiotic factors, of course, can change over time. So think about climate change, but also they can change, of course, over a natural gradient. Okay, so here, what we can see is resource availability, right? So maybe over here, resources are super abundant. Okay, over here, resources are limited, right? We can think about different environments where there would be a lot of resources and fewer resources, or, a temperature gradient, etc. And so because of these, essentially fundamental niches overlapping, we see very high competition here where the resources are super high, and much lower competition over here, essentially opening up some available space, available resources for only those species that are acclimated or that are adapted to low resource environments. And so, just like we've been seeing before, we see this nice niche partitioning with maybe the high growth rate, super hungry plants occupying this part of the physical space. The species E, right, is really low, slow growing, but is okay with very few resources. And so it can fill this part of the niche over here. And we can see that at different parts along this gradient, there is this nice separation of species locations. And so we saw this when Eric came to our class and talked about Arizona. Here we can see the different zones that are produced along this environmental gradient. In this case, it is an altitude gradient, which also comes with temperature gradients and moisture gradients as well, just like we talked about in the very beginning of class. And so the reason why these particular species end up where they do is because of this competition driving the niches apart, right? Driving this niche partitioning, and ultimately, creating these more or less definitive zones. We can also see this along a shoreline gradient. We've seen this example before, but essentially here's the water, here are upland plants. And so, as we move in this direction, there's more and more physical stress, right? So there's less oxygen in the soil. There might be more salt in the soil, more salt in the water. And so the plants that are able to withstand those particular conditions won't have the same level of competition in those really stressful conditions, just because not everybody has those same adaptations. Not everybody can live in such a harsh environment. Okay. On the other hand, up here, there's less water, right? And so these plants would be more adapted to less moisture, right? More droughty conditions. Okay, so once again, we see this very distinct zonation. One of the things that a lot of ecological surveyors do is wetland delineation. So essentially they look at the soil, they look at the vegetation type, and essentially say, here is where the wetland stops. Right? That's important because you're only allowed to build in upland environments. If you do build in a wetland environment, you're required to build another wetland of the same area. Of course, they're never as good as the original, the ones that were naturally made, but really important if you are a developer.